The Shadow Over Wallachia, born in blood. The wind howled across the Carpathian peaks like a wounded beast, carrying with it the scent of iron and smoke. On a storm-split night in a fortress carved from black stone, Vlad was born, a child whose first cry was drowned by thunder. The midwives whispered that the storm was no coincidence. He came with the shadow, they said. His father, Vlad Dracula, knelt before a flickering fire emblazoned with the sigil of the dragon, an oath to protect Christendom against the Ottoman tide. But the oath was a lie, and the dragon's heart was split in two. To one emperor, he offered loyalty. To another, he offered secrets. Between them, Wallachia was no kingdom. It was a battlefield of promises and betrayals, soaked in the blood of its people. From the moment he could walk, young Vlad learned that survival was not a virtue, but a performance. He watched his father smile before men he despised, watched gifts turn to threats and allies to executioners. His mother's eyes followed him everywhere, haunted, knowing the child's fate would be carved from his father's sins. The court was a nest of daggers hidden behind velvet words. And at its center, the boy with dark eyes, too quiet, too observant, studied every deceit as if it were scripture. Servants swore that shadows clung to him longer than to other children, as though the night itself refused to let him go. But destiny does not wait for men to grow. When his father's fragile web of allegiance tore apart, the vengeance of kings came for the Dracula line. Armored riders thundered through the forests, and the banner of the dragon burned. Vlad's father, desperate to save his bloodline, made a final, terrible bargain, surrendering his sons to the Sultan in exchange for his crown. So, beneath a sky bruised by stormlight, the boy who should have been a prince was bound and led away. Behind him, his homeland smoldered, the mountains silent witnesses to the birth of something far greater than a child. A seed of wrath was planted that night, and in the years to come, it would grow into legend and into terror. The Prisoner of the Crescent, Lessons in Fear. The boy who left Wallachia was not a prisoner, not yet. He was a sacrifice, a living pledge bound in silence. When the iron gates of the Ottoman fortress closed behind him, the world of forests and frost was replaced by marble, sand, and shadows that whispered in a language he barely understood. They called him Vlad Dracula, son of the dragon, but here his name meant nothing. He was stripped of titles, of honor, of safety. Only the blood in his veins reminded him who he was. Days became indistinguishable from nights. The call to prayer echoed through corridors that smelled of sweat and oil, each note a reminder that he was deep inside the empire his father had once promised to serve, and secretly betrayed. The guards laughed as they beat him, amused by his defiance. His brother wept. Vlad did not. Fear was the first language he learned in captivity. Fear of the lash, fear of hunger, fear of silence. But he also learned that fear could be studied, shaped, used. He began to see it not as a prison, but as a weapon that could be turned outward. He watched the Sultan's tutors with cold fascination, how they ruled their students not with kindness, but control. He saw power in the smallest cruelties, a delay in mercy, a promise denied, a punishment delayed until despair fermented into obedience. And slowly, something within him changed. One night, when a fellow hostage tried to escape, Vlad did not warn him. He listened to the screams from the courtyard, to the dull rhythm of the whip, until dawn painted the stones red. Then he whispered to himself, "Mercy is the lie that weak men tell themselves before they die." He was no longer the frightened child of Wallachia. He became a student of the empire, not of its faith, but of its dark genius for control. Years passed. The boy grew into something leaner, sharper, unreadable. His captors saw only obedience, never realizing that every command they gave him was another lesson in domination. And when the day came that his chains were struck off, he did not look back at his cell. He smiled, a small, thin curve of lips that held no joy, because the boy they had imprisoned was gone. In his place stood Vlad the Impaler in waiting, forged not in freedom, but in fear. The blood of the dragon, return of the prince. When the gates of the Ottoman fortress finally opened, Vlad did not step into freedom. He stepped into memory. The air of Wallachia was colder, sharper than he remembered, scented with pine, mud, and blood. Every village seemed quieter, as though the land itself held its breath at his return. He rode alone through ruins that once bore his father's banner. The dragon's standard was gone, its sigil torn and burned. In its place flew the colors of pretenders and cowards who had sold Wallachhia's soul for peace. His father was dead, betrayed by those who had sworn allegiance. His brother buried alive, the earth itself sealing his screams. And yet the people whispered. They spoke of omens, of a dark prince returning from the clutches of the crescent, of a ghost son who had survived the empire's chains. Vlad did not come for coronation. He came for reckoning. At the courts of the boyars, the nobles who had once bowed to his father now smiled with poisoned lips. They saw a thin, pale youth, courteous, soft-spoken, almost deferential. They mistook silence for weakness. Vlad let them. He dined with them, drank their wine, and listened to their conspiracies bloom like rot in the dark. But vengeance is not a blade drawn in haste. It is a slow, deliberate incision. One by one, he began to turn his enemies against each other, weaving rumor into rivalry, suspicion into betrayal. He whispered truths that sounded like lies and lies that sounded like salvation. Soon, brothers accused brothers, alliances fractured, and the court became a pit of madness. When the trap finally closed, it did so with elegance. The feast that was meant to honor Wallachhia's unity became its purification. At Vlad's silent command, doors locked, guards surrounded the hall, and the laughter of nobles turned to pleading. No sword was drawn that night. Only promises were broken. By dawn, the boyar's power had devoured itself, and Vlad Dracula rose, untouched amid the wreckage. The dragon's blood had spoken at last, and its message was clear. Mercy was dead, and the age of fear had begun. A throne built on stakes, the terror begins. The crown had been claimed, but power is never won without proof, and Vlad's proof was written in blood. The forests around Targovishte, once quiet and green, became a grotesque cathedral of terror. Every tree seemed to shiver under the weight of corpses impaled on sharpened stakes, their faces frozen in final expressions of horror. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying the scent of iron and decay, a reminder to all who dared question the prince that obedience was not optional. He moved through his lands like a specter, not for glory, not for ceremony, but for justice as he alone understood it. Traitors, thieves, and corrupt nobles were drawn to the stakes as if called by fate itself. Peasants watched in a mixture of awe and terror, unsure whether to worship the man who protected them or fear the monster who ruled over them. Yet Vlad did not act without purpose. Every impalement was a message, a ritual of fear and morality, a mirror to the cruelty he had learned in captivity. His court became a labyrinth of suspicion, whispers carried like smoke through stone corridors. One could be noble by birth, but damned by silence. Loyalty was measured in courage under terror, and deceit met its match in the dragon's unyielding gaze. Even as enemies crumbled, the people murmured, "Has our savior become a demon?" The question haunted the air like mist over the Carpathians. Yet none dared speak it aloud, for the prince's eyes could pierce armor, stone, and soul alike. Vlad's reign was not merely a rule. It was a living nightmare, a kingdom carved in flesh, where justice and vengeance intertwined like lovers in the dark. And in the shadows of the impaled, the seeds of legend took root, whispering that fear could be both shield and sword, and that the boy who had once been a prisoner was now the master of dread itself. The night of the Impaler, war with the Sultan. The night was alive with whispers and shadows, the moon a pale witness to the terror about to unfold. The Ottoman army, vast and confident, descended upon Wallachia like a tide of steel and ambition, believing the prince who had risen in silence to be no more than a tyrant of local legend. But Vlad moved like a phantom. Cloaked in the black of midnight, he walked among the enemy, studying them, learning the rhythm of their campfires, the cadence of their sentries, the weaknesses in their pride. His men, fewer in number but sharpened by desperation and loyalty, followed with silent obedience, their breaths stolen by fear and awe. Then at the hour when the world sleeps, the storm struck. Flames licked tents like the tongues of devils. Confusion rippled through the ranks as the Wallachian forces attacked in disguise, blending with shadows, striking with precise cruelty. Swords bit, screams split the air, and blood painted the earth a dark, sacred red. By dawn, the Sultan's eyes fell upon a sight that would haunt his empire for years. A forest of 20,000 impaled corpses, each one a grim sentinel, a monument to the price of defiance. The sheer scale of it made the invaders stagger. Horror overriding strategy, fear surpassing fury. The invincible army faltered. They had come to conquer a prince, and instead had witnessed the power of terror itself made flesh. Yet for Vlad, victory was a bitter elixir. In the silence after the screams, in the shadow of the stakes rising like blackened candles against the morning sky, he felt the first tremors of the weight that would never leave him. For in every act of cruelty, he sensed a reflection of his own soul, sharp and relentless, staring back at him from the eyes of the dead. The Sultan retreated, leaving Wallachia untouched but trembling, and the prince returned to his forests, his lands, and his nightmares. Because victory carried no joy, only the reminder that fear is a crown heavier than any gold. The betrayal of kings, from hero to captive. Even the strongest walls cannot protect a man from treachery born of friendship. Vlad, who had turned fear into a weapon and terror into law, learned this cruel truth from the hand he thought steady beside him. King Matthias Corvinus, whose words had once promised alliance and admiration, revealed a different face, cold, calculating, and ruthless. In the court of supposed camaraderie, the prince was labeled mad, a dangerous shadow to be caged and controlled. Chains replaced crowns, and freedom became an illusion carved from iron. Vlad's captors thought that confinement would crush him, that the mind honed on cruelty would bend to sorrow. But the prince did not break. Within the walls of his cell, surrounded by darkness, vermin, and the stale scent of neglect, he listened to the scratching of rats, the echo of dripping water, the whispers of wind through the stones. Every sound became a teacher, every shadow a companion. He spoke to no one, yet the world around him trembled under the weight of his silent fury. Every insult, every betrayal, every treacherous smile from the king and his court became a promise etched in his memory. They can cage my body, but not the fear that bears my name. Outside, Wallachia shivered in the absence of its dragon. Without the terror that had kept the land in balance, chaos gnawed at the borders. Nobles schemed in open daylight, and enemies of the prince stirred like snakes sensing an empty throne. And yet in that darkness, Vlad's wrath did not sleep. It festered, slow and deliberate, feeding on betrayal, sharpening like a blade against the stone of his imprisonment. Though men thought him powerless, the shadow of his return grew taller each day, haunting even those who would have forgotten his name. Because the prince who had walked among the Ottoman dead, who had ruled with stakes and shadow, was not defeated. He was only waiting for the hour when the world would remember that fear has a master. The return of the dragon, the last reign. Years had passed, yet the chains of his captivity had not weakened him. They had hardened him like iron and fire. Vlad returned to Wallachia not as a boy, not as a pawn, but as a force whose shadow alone could bend men's wills. The forests whispered his name, the rivers ran with memory, and the mountains themselves seemed to rise in salute or in warning. But the land he had once ruled trembled in his absence. New powers had grown in the hollows of Wallachia's valleys. Nobles who had feasted in the darkness of his exile now smiled with dangerous confidence. Allies had turned to rivals. Enemies had grown bold. The court was no longer a hall of respect. It was a theater of suspicion, conspiracy, and fragile loyalty. Vlad did not announce his return. He slid through the shadows of his own land, observing, calculating, listening to the heartbeat of betrayal. Every alliance he had once trusted had become a web of treachery. Every face familiar was now a mask hiding a dagger. When he struck, it was precise, terrible, and poetic. Betrayers fell into one another's plots. Rival factions destroyed themselves under the weight of their own ambition. Flames lit the forests. Blood ran through streets like ink on parchment, and whispers spread that the dragon had returned, not as a prince but as judgment itself. Yet even as he reclaimed his throne, Vlad felt the familiar stirrings of prophecy and fate. Power was a cruel companion. The more he wielded it, the more he realized that monsters, even kings, are trapped in cycles they cannot escape. Wallachia trembled under his hand, and in the terror he inspired, the people saw both their savior and their doom. The dragon had returned, and legend and horror walked beside him. But deep in the prince's heart, the knowledge remained. Every empire he conquered, every enemy he crushed, every ally he outwitted, carried a cost written in his own blood and in the blood of those who dared defy him. Wallachia would remember, tremble and whisper, for Vlad the Impaler had returned, and fear itself was his crown. The death without a body, the final twist. The battlefield was silent, but silence in Wallachia was never peace. Smoke curled from shattered tents, the rivers ran dark with blood, and the wind carried whispers of horror and awe. Amid the chaos of clashing swords and shattered shields, Vlad vanished, his body swallowed by shadow, rumor, or the earth itself. Some said he had been struck down by his own men, a blade in the dark ending the reign of terror. Others swore the prince had walked from the battle unscathed, his eyes burning like coals, leaving nothing but footprints on the bloodied soil. No body was ever found, no tomb marked the site. Only the echoes of screams and the memory of his cruelty remained. And so a legend began to breathe on its own. Villagers claimed to see him walking the forest at night, a shadow with red eyes glimmering in the moonlight, carrying vengeance that had never been quenched. Horses bolted at the whisper of his name. Wolves howled as if in mourning or warning. Even the wind seemed to carry his presence, twisting through the mountains and valleys like an unseen hand, reminding all that some terror cannot be buried, some monsters cannot die. The absence of his body became a presence stronger than flesh, a story that grew with every telling, feeding on fear and imagination alike. For in Wallachia, the final truth was terrifyingly simple. Vlad the Impaler's reign did not end with a death. It lingered in every shadow, every trembling heart, every whispered name, a darkness that refused to fade. Because the real horror was never his mortality. It was the silence that followed him. An empty throne, a vanished body, and the certainty that what had been unleashed could never truly be contained. The immortal name, from tyrant to vampire. Centuries passed, and the mountains and forests of Wallachia remained, patient witnesses to a story that refused to die. The man who had walked through fire, through betrayal, through the impaled forests of his own making, had vanished, or perhaps had never truly left. Then came a pen centuries later, and with it a new form of immortality. Bram Stoker wrote of Dracula, a creature of night, of fangs and thirst, and the world trembled at the name. But fiction cannot birth a monster greater than reality. For Vlad had already carved his legend into the bones of Wallachia, into the blood of enemies, into the echoes of terror that lingered in every shadow. History remembered him differently depending on who spoke. To some, he was a tyrant, a devil made flesh, a name to frighten children. To others, he was a patriot, a guardian of his land, a dragon who had defended his people against empires and invaders. And yet all agreed on one truth: the legend would never die. Every empire that rose feared his memory. Every storyteller that dared to twist his story found a shadow of Vlad lurking in the telling. The forests he once ruled whispered his name in the wind. The rivers carried his shadow downstream, and every shadowed alley in distant lands seemed to hint at his return. Because Vlad the Impaler never truly died. He did not vanish. He transformed. From man to myth, from tyrant to vampire, from fear to immortality, he became a creature whose thirst outlasted empires, whose name haunted centuries. And as long as darkness exists, somewhere in the folds of history and imagination, he waits, eternal, unyielding, and unforgotten.